Today I'll be presenting on the topic of sovereign and symbiotic, a both-and approach to reconciling ways of knowing. First, I'll start out with an introduction of who I am. Hello everyone, my name is Lindsay Brandt and I'm from Tyendinaga Mohawk Territory. My Mohawk name is Haudenosaunee, which means she carries the words. I'm an educational developer, Indigenous pedagogies and ways of knowing in the Center for Teaching and Learning at Queen's. I also am a part-time student and beginner language learner taking the Mohawk Language and Certificate program through Queen's. So the topic today is to talk about ways of knowing and how we might consider both Western and Indigenous approaches or ways of knowing and what that can mean for our work as students, as professionals, as faculty in higher education. So there's no single Indigenous or Western way of knowing. It is easy to think of ways of knowing in terms of a dichotomy, but in doing so we risk homogenizing or othering those ways. That said, in order to begin a conversation about how both Indigenous and Western ways can meaningfully coexist, we have to talk a little bit about what each can or might include. So we'll start with a brief exploration of each before we dive deeper into this topic. Indigenous ways of knowing can be conceptualized in many different ways, and it's important to talk about when we talk about Indigenous ways of knowing to recognize the beauty and complexity and diversity that exists in ways of knowing. Many people continue to generalize Indigenous experience and lived realities or kind of pan-Indigenize what that can mean. But the intent of the phrase Indigenous ways of knowing is just to help educate or guide people about the vast variety of knowledge that exists across diverse Indigenous communities and groups and nations. It also signals that as individuals, we don't just learn from human interaction and relationships, we also learn from all elements of creation, and that many aspects of creation can be our teachers. We can learn from plants and animals, we can learn from objects that many people would consider to be inanimate, but in our framework and understanding, we are all related and we're all connected in many ways, and we can learn and teach with each other beyond just ourselves as humans. So our Indigenous ways of knowing are incredibly sophisticated and complex. These ways relate to specific ecology in countless locations, so they're grounded in language and practice in cultural of Indigenous communities, which may look different from one group to the next. Yet there's a commonality and many common elements among the ways of knowing. They're deeply rooted in a respect for the land and the necessity of a reciprocal relationship with the land itself. There's also some commonalities which include metaphysical, holistic, and oral or symbolic connections or relations, and then a relationality and an intergenerational component as well. So recognizing that what we do today can impact generations to come, and a lot of our knowledge and understanding is framed from a context of carrying forward from previous generations. So recognizing that knowledge can exist in between spaces and places, and that we carry that with us in many ways. So Western knowledge systems. Western knowledge tends to be broken into disciplines. So we often think in terms of math and linguistics, logic, rationality, objectivity, and measurement of observable phenomenon are often characterized Western knowledge systems. The philosophical tradition of positivism, which rejects the metaphysical or spiritual realm as a source of knowledge, has had an impact on Western thought too. So this is especially true in natural science disciplines but it's also common in social sciences too. So Western science is often actually criticized for being anthropocentric, which means humankind at the center of everything, or the most important element of existence. You can see that this is in contrast to what I described as Indigenous ways of knowing, where humankind is actually decentered, and we recognize that we rely on all of creation to support our lives. So we're actually one of the least important aspects of creation. So with Western, presenting a subject or problem in a more simplified form, and then knowledge is treated as a thing rather than also involving actions, experiences, and relationships. So Western thinking tends to view the land as an object of study rather than as a relation. And then within Western ways of thinking, there are also some research paradigms that are compatible with Indigenous ways of thinking and knowing. Um, for example, feminist schools of thought give rise to methodologies that are somewhat compatible with Indigenous methodologies, such as storytelling, as well you'll come across critical and reflexive methodologies that might take into account the effect of the personality or presence of the researcher and what's being investigated. So some more subjective approaches often lend themselves to working well with Indigenous approaches or Indigenous ways of knowing. So there are a few research frameworks that link Indigenous and Western knowledges. There's quite a few out there that exist actually, and I wanted to focus this presentation just on two of them because I wanted to ground these frameworks and talk about these frameworks that are important to me because they're actually grounded in my own cultural teachings and worldview as a Haudenosaunee woman. So the two that I'll focus on today are the Two Row Wampum as a framework or way of understanding or a teaching around that, and also the story or the concept of the three sisters. So first I'll talk about the Two Row Wampum. The Two Row Wampum Belt represents an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and the European settlers. Although the agreement is several hundred years old, the story it tells is still relevant today. So it talks about the two purple lines that you see here on the screen on the belt itself symbolize two paths or two vessels. One is the path or the way of the Haudenosaunee peoples, and then the other is the way of the European people. Each group has its own laws, beliefs, ways of life, ways of knowing, and the belt teaches us that each should travel side by side but without interfering in the lives of the other. So in this way, the two groups can continue to coexist in mutual peace and harmony and respect for each other. But between those two rows too, you'll see is a row of white beads on either side and in between. So these white beads are meant to symbolize the purity of the agreement, and some say that it also represents the river of life. So these were made to stand for friendship, peace, and respect between the two nations. And as much as the three rows keep the two nations separate, it also binds them together. So you can see the way that those two lines exist, those two paths of the two vessels exist side by side, but they never cross over. They don't interfere with each other, but they exist in a way that we can see both of them, and they're on an equal playing field, and you can learn much from both ways of doing things. So that Two Row Wampum is a way of situating ourselves and grounding ourselves and developing relationship with others, but it also really should be the driver in the way we conceptualize our ways of knowing and how we can learn so much from other ways of knowing, but also maintain the integrity and the basis of our own ways of knowing too. So the other teaching I wanted to share with you is the three sisters. So the three sisters are comprised of corn, beans, and squash. They're natural companions that aid in each other's growth, development, and survival. So you'll see in the image they're conceptualized with the plants themselves, but also humans. So often in my culture and growing up, I was taught the three sisters stories to think about it in terms of actually three human sisters that represent those three plants and what that relationship and that connection that they share can teach us. So corn is the sturdy corn stalk provides structure and support for the beans to climb. The beans, they return nitrogen to the soil, feeding the corn and squash vital nutrients that they need. And then the squash spreads across the ground, choking out weeds and maintaining moisture in the soil. It also protects from invasive pests or animals that are drawn to the food. So the Haudenosaunee peoples, my peoples, would have planted, and we still continue to plant these three sisters, these three crops together because we recognize that they all are strong on their own, but together they support each other in such a symbiotic and beautiful way. And that each one on its own is strong, but together they are so strong and they support each other in so many ways. They're also, when you eat those three vegetables together, when you eat those together, they provide a very balanced diet, a very balanced amount of nutrients, and they are just so powerful together. So I think that this teaches us so much about the way that we should live our lives, and recognizing our strengths as individuals, but also recognizing the collective strength that we have when we share our knowledge with each other and our approaches to, and our ways of thinking. So, as a conclusion, and some of my thoughts around this are that there's value in the both and approach to ways of knowing and reconciling those ways of knowing. So, what I mean by both and is that there's value in all ways of knowing, and we can recognize and appreciate and learn about those ways of knowing without choosing one or the other, or without giving privilege to one over another. And what it really teaches us and what it causes us to do is to reflect on our own ways of knowing, our own approach to teaching and learning, our own approach to engaging with the world, and considering what privilege, bias, different things do I bring to my worldview, and how can I maybe expand that worldview and bring in other ways of knowing to strengthen my approach to life or my approach to studying and those types of things. So, with a careful approach that recognizes our colonial past and the power imbalances that exist between Indigenous and Western societies, we can carefully move forward with the goal of reconciling ways of knowing so that both Indigenous and Western approaches can be used to inform our thinking, the ways that we approach learning, and the ways that we coexist on the lands we share together. So the goal is to rebalance things so that Indigenous ways of knowing are recognized as valid, are respectfully valued and meaningfully explored, and are carried forward in a good way. So the goal is to see both Indigenous and Western approaches as strong and sovereign on their own, but also to see the incredible opportunity for growth and learning that can occur when we link the two together for the purposes of extending our mindsets and shaping our societies. So I think the value in different subject areas for bringing in different approaches and thinking about um, weaving in Indigenous ways of knowing is that there's so much perspective it can offer. So, for example, in a music course, when you're thinking about music, you're thinking about the value of song and the meaning behind song. What is the value for Indigenous groups? What did song mean to them? What did um, culture and their way of thinking? How did that make them think differently than maybe a Western um, lens or approach to thinking about music might be? So, for example, songs for us carry a lot of teachings. They carry a lot. They're related a lot to our culture, our language. Our language is a huge part of what carries our culture forward. And so, for songs are often sung in ceremony. They're sung for certain purposes and for certain situations that might call for them to strengthen ourselves individually, but also collectively when we're participating in ceremony or participating in different cultural events or circumstances. So there's so much meaning and so much exploration that can occur, and expansion of your frame of reference can occur when you are opening yourself up to exploring other ways of knowing. Um, Other examples, even the three sister example that I gave, is a different way of thinking about a horticulture and ecology and all of those things. It's a different way of relating to the earth and thinking about the land and thinking about connections between things. And it really does shift the way that you think about not only certain disciplines or certain aspects of our lives, but like more collectively, it can shape the way that we relate to one another. It can have powerful effects on our relationship building and our capacity building as communities and as people that are walking forward with the goal of reconciliation. It really does come down to relationship and connection, and a huge part of Indigenous ways of knowing are about relationality and thinking about ourselves in relation to others, and not just others in the sense of humans, but as I mentioned, all aspects of creation. So I hope that this presentation has done a little bit to expand your thinking towards what possibilities might exist when you explore different ways of knowing, and what connections you can begin to make in your own learning, regardless of what discipline you find yourself studying in, how or teaching in. How can you bridge ways of knowing so that you're benefiting from the strengths of everything that those ways of knowing entail. So those are just two main approaches that I highlighted, two frameworks for understanding these concepts. You'll note in the next slide I've provided some additional resources for further learning. So under the first resource, what are Indigenous and Western ways of knowing? That study actually highlights 19 additional frameworks that researchers found when they explored frameworks for thinking about or conceptualizing the connection and correlation between Indigenous and Western ways of knowing and how they can work together when we engage in research or practice or learning. And then the second resource that I provided here is called Let's Change the Subject, Grounding Social Change in Indigenous History and Philosophy. That one talks a lot about different aspects of Indigenous ways of knowing and how they can lend themselves to creating social change. And then the last is the Ways of Knowing guide that the Toronto Zoo actually put together with a bunch of different knowledge keepers across Turtle Island to explore various aspects of ways of knowing from different cultural perspectives. It has Haudenosaunee, it also has Haudenosaunee perspectives in there, and from a variety of different perspectives and sources. So those are some additional ways that you can begin to learn about ways of knowing. So thank you very much for listening, and keep an eye on the Center for Teaching and Learning website for further resources around this.